Chapter 7. There was a special feeling about the Christmas preparations that year. The immortals were determined to fight the gloom that had gathered over the kingdom with Herakon's curse, and often they succeeded. The narrow, climbing streets of the village seethed with activity as the Yuletide was honored in manifold and marvelous ways. The air grew rich with the smell of puddings, candies, and other treats. The houses rang with songs and carols, and the gardens and walls were lined with garlands and wreaths. In every corner, the great task of manufacturing gifts for the world's children surged forward. All day and deep into the night, immortals wielded and welded, hammered and harnessed, carved and curled. The fawns galloped around with the little baskets of doll parts, which they delivered to the Gilfins, who had 6 hands apiece and could assemble them with dizzying speed. The Trojan heroes spent hours by their firesides, crafting perfect toy soldiers for small boy soldiers. The pixies were in charge of joke toys, as usual, and one of their earth-dwelling cousins came up with a splendid new invention, shiny bubbles that floated right into your mouth and came out of your nose. The fairies, who had been put in charge of packaging, produced the most exquisite presents that the land of the immortals had ever seen, each wrapped in luminous fairy paper with pink and silver bows. Gaia and her maidens coaxed the largest fir tree in the kingdom to come to the square of the Sibyls for a few weeks. The tree was quite vain, and when the goddess promised her the most elegant decorations in the universe, she couldn't refuse. And Gaia was as good as her word. Pulling stars from the heavens, she hung the tree with their winking lights and with prisms made from the obliging jeweled glaciers. The fairies came to perch upon its branches too, and with their wings unfurled, they looked for all the world like a flock of small gilded butterflies. In the afternoon of December 24, when Nicholas and his reindeer made their traditional procession through the village to collect the toys from the various workshops, he stopped to admire the tree. "It's the most beautiful one we have ever had," he said to Gaia, who inclined her head graciously. He looked around the square, which was lighted with torches against the early dusk and garlanded with holly in honor of the new princess. "Perhaps," he said hopefully to the immortals who gathered around to wish him well, "this Christmas will be the most beautiful ever." The assembled goblins, fairies, fauns, and sprites nodded in agreement, and the centaurs, who had rich baritone voices, joined together to sing him along his way. Nicholas leaned back against the bulging sacks that stuffed his sleigh and hoped that Christmas would bring comfort to his sorrowful kingdom. "Peace on earth, goodwill to humankind," he murmured, lightly touching the reins to urge the reindeer forward. Catching the spirit of their master, the reindeer dashed jubilantly along the snow, pulling the sleigh as if it weighed no more than a feather. "What's the trouble, Donner?" called Nicholas as they slowed near the gates. "There's a crowd gathered, sire," the reindeer replied in a low voice. "I'm afraid I'll hurt them if I jump." There was a small, wistful group of immortals huddled near the shimmering gates. They bowed to Nicholas as his sleigh drew up alongside them, and one of the wizards came forward. "Please, Father Christmas, I have a favor to beg of you," he began nervously, his old eyes fixed pleadingly on Nicholas. Couldn't it be possible, permissible, to take me with you tonight? I could just sit here in the back, you see, next to the sack. I won't weigh much, sire, and my little king, the one I'm guardian to, he's in a terrible way." "I don't think it would be allowed, Cadmus," said Nicholas sympathetically. The old wizard was near tears. "He's going to get himself killed, sire. He's listening to the wrong people, and his uncle is plotting against him, and he's only a boy." Nicholas looked at the old man's face and then leaned out and grasped his wrinkled wrist. "Climb in, sir. We shall do our best." Faces brightened in the little knot, for if Cadmus could go back to the mortal world, then so could they eventually. The reindeer wheeled around and retraced their tracks to get a good running start. Eagerly, they stretched forward and began their leap. Up, up, the sleigh was almost airborne. But then something happened, or rather, didn't happen. The reindeer crashed into the ground, their hooves scrambling against the ice. A horrible suspicion jumped unbidden into Nicholas's mind. Perhaps he'd been mistaken. Perhaps his Christmas journey was now forbidden. He tried to push the thought away. "One more time," he murmured to Donner. "It's him," Donner gestured to the wizard, who pretended not to hear. We'll try it one more time, repeated Nicholas. So they did. The same crash and scramble occurred. Gloomily, Nicholas and the reindeer backed up yet again, this time without a passenger. For the third time, he gave the command, and the reindeer leaped forward. Their hooves pounded on the hard-packed ice, and now, yes, they were up, the sleigh rushing through the air behind them. It was going to be all right. Nicholas shouted jubilantly to the whole universe, "Merry Christmas!" Far below, Cadmus screamed in a quavering voice, "Tell him to ignore General Vandershot! Ignore Vandershot!" "Yes, of course," Nicholas cried, waving. Of all the citizens in the land of the immortals, Holly was the least troubled by the curse that had befallen forever. She lay in a lacy cradle, or in her mother's arms, making gentle baby sounds of delight at the snow that whisked around her. After the first few nightmarish weeks, Viviana had woken from her trance of dead, determined that her child would flourish in her frozen surroundings. "I won't have her treated like an invalid," she said to Nicholas. "She must have a child like any other." Gently, Nicholas reminded her that Holly was not like any other child. "Still, she has to have a wonderful childhood," said Viviana firmly. "She will," said Nicholas. They gazed down at the smiling Holly, cradled in Viviana's arms. "Isn't she the most beautiful thing?" asked Viviana. Nicholas touched a tiny pink finger. "The most beautiful thing," he agreed. "You know what I think?" he said suddenly. "I think the will-o'-the-wisps are here, and that's what's making her smile." "Really? They're here?" "I'm not certain, but that's my guess." "You could find out easily enough." "I could, but the wisps like to be let alone. I'll ask them at the next convocation." "But that's not for 100 years, protested Viviana. "I can wait," Nicholas said calmly. Viviana smiled down at Holly. "Your father is a very patient man. Your mother, on the other hand, is still living with the mortal clock," interrupted Nicholas, smiling. "I wonder which of us she'll take after." "You, I hope. She does seem even-tempered. Never cries," Nicholas said. "Not since that night." Viviana's voice trembled. "Hush, hush. It's over now," counseled Nicholas. "It's not over," cried Viviana. "Our child lives in a snowstorm." "Yes, I have been thinking about that very thing, my dear. We need to make a few improvements in Holly's nursery." Holly's room was soon transformed from a typical, if lavish, nursery to a frozen wonderland. The floor was laid out in large tiles of mother-of-pearl, a soft rainbow glowing in each square of milky white. The tapestries that lined the walls were removed and replaced with rows of delicate shells. Holly's cradle, too, was fashioned from a giant shell and draped with a canopy of the thinnest gossamer silk. The rose-petal quilt that Guy had given Holly was all the cover she needed now, and on the coldest winter nights she slept under the flowers, breathing their soft, eternal scent. When the thick velvet curtains had been removed from the high windows that stretched across one side of the room, Viviana had a sudden inspiration. She called into the balconied gnomes, famous for their silence and their superb metalwork, and asked them to make the princess a grove of silver trees. "A grove of trees," she repeated, "and silver. Don't you think that would be nice?" she babbled, sounding ridiculous, even to herself. "Yes," said Samandra, the leader of the Valcanids. "Can you make such a thing?" "Yes," he said simply. At that, the entire group bowed quickly and took their leave. A few days later, they returned, nearly 100 of them, carrying the trees. They were exquisite. Tall silver birches, oaks, and maples climbed from the floor and branched out all over Holly's ceiling, their limbs tapering to a delicate spray of leaves, each paper-thin and veined in a flawless replica of nature's own miracle. In Holly's room, a forest grew, a crystal forest that offered cool shade for the summer months and a glittering lace of branches in the winter. The gnomes had used their magic well, and the silver trees followed the seasons like all others. "It's magnificent," Viviana said, staring in amazement at what they had brought. "You have made a marvel," agreed Nicholas, looking gratefully at Samander. The Valkenids bowed. There was a silence. A few gnomes nudged Samander with their elbows. Sighing, he took off his hat and stepped forward. He said. "Yes," said Viviana. "Ask for anything, Samander." He began again. Then, clearing his throat loudly, he said, "Can we see her?" "Holly?" asked Viviana. The gnomes nodded. "Certainly, of course. I didn't know you hadn't at the christening," stammered Viviana. "Too short." So Viviana brought Holly from the next room. The gnomes crowded around, gravely observing the baby's sleep-flushed cheeks and drowsy eyes. Finally, Samander put out a stubby brown hand to touch the little reddish gold curl that had recently sprouted atop her head. "Good," he said with finality. Bowing quickly, the Valkenids turned and left. Exactly 1 year and 1 day after Herakon's assault on the land of the Immortals, Tundra returned. On a crisp fall afternoon, Nicholas was deeply immersed in a particularly murky human dispute. His spectacles resting atop his head, his desk covered with testimonies and counter-testimonies, when the door of his study opened quietly and Tundra limped in. The two friends stared at each other in silence. The wolf looked thin and worn, his fur ragged and his eyes tired. Nicholas saw that he had a long raised scar on his right forepaw, but he knew that Tundra would not willingly tell him how he had acquired it, nor anything else of the long year he had spent on the edges of the country as a solitary animal. "Welcome home, friend," Nicholas greeted him quietly. "I have missed you more than I can say." "Thank you, sire. I am glad to be home." Tundra limped toward the rug that lay in front of the crackling fire. He turned once, preparing to lay himself down, but stopped suddenly and leaned his head forward to smell the rug. He stiffened and then walked on his tired legs to another part of the room, beside Nicholas's desk, where he lay down without a word. In less than a minute, he was asleep. Nicholas stared down at the familiar face and waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. When he was finally certain that Tundra would not awake, he pushed his chair and tiptoed out to tell Viviana the news, and to find a soft rug to lay next to his desk. Tundra slept for 3 days, waking only to consume enormous quantities of meat and drink copious draughts of water. On the 4th day, Nicholas was again at his desk, still hard at work, when Holly toppled in the door. "Bump," she said. Holly had been a determined but not very dignified walker for the last 3 weeks. Each day she tried to escape from the nursery suite, causing her mother and the nursery goblins no end of alarm, for the crackling fires and stoves that heated the rest of the palace posed a risk to Holly's snow heart. Ignorant of the danger, Holly scooted out the nursery door at every opportunity, eager to explore the fascinating territories beyond her room. She never cried when she was picked up and removed to where she was supposed to be. She just hummed and tried to wrap the goblins' hair around their noses. Twice she had succeeded in escaping. The first time she had been found in the attic room where the old magic wands were kept. This garret was quite cold, but who knows what kind of wish a 1-year-old baby might make, Viviana had moaned. The second time Holly had made her way to Nicholas's study, a place she immediately concluded was paradise, for it contained not only her daddy, but also a variety of interesting objects like globes and books and ink and a letter opener that were all too dangerous to be within her reach. Forgetting her fugitive status, in his delight, Nicholas had tossed her in the air, showed her interesting pictures and animals of the planet Earth, and held her up to the open window to see the trees tossing in the wind. By the time a wild-eyed goblin burst into the room in a desperate search for the baby, Holly and Nicholas had become allies for all time. Now she had once again escaped and headed straight for Nicholas's study. She picked herself up and chortled at her father. He chortled back. Her eyes scanned the room in search of the nice, dangerous letter opener, and she caught sight of Tundra sleeping on his side. When she encountered anything truly compelling, Holly abandoned walking in favor of the speedier crawl. In an instant, she was breathing heavily in Tundra's face, her nose pressed up against his. She inspected him closely. "Dog," she said. Tundra didn't even open his eyes. "I am not a dog," he said. "Dog," she repeated, reaching for an ear. Tundra lifted his head and looked at Nicholas. "There's a small person in your study, sire," he said. "I know it, Tundra. That's Holly," said Nicholas distractedly, waving one hand to put out the fire and the other to open the windows. "Ah, Holly," Tundra squinted as she pulled more firmly on his ear. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, your highness." "Dog! I am not a dog!" "Woof!" "Exactly," said Tundra, and there was something in his voice that made Nicholas turn. Holly was patting the wolf's soft neck gently, and Tundra was smiling. The next morning, Nicholas observed, peeking over his spectacles, that the wolf raised his head expectantly each time footsteps passed in the hallway outside the door. He said nothing, and Nicholas, too, kept a discreet silence. But after lunch, Nicholas returned to his desk to find Tundra's rug empty. The afternoon ticked quietly away. 1 hour, 2 hours, and still he did not return. At 4 o'clock, consumed by curiosity, Nicholas slammed his books shut and walked ever so casually toward the nursery. He heard them before he saw them. Holly was shrieking, "Go, go, go!" between gales of laughter, and Alexia, sounding determined, was calling, "Hold still, hold still!" Nicholas opened the door. Holly, dressed in a blue nightgown which revealed that she was supposed to be napping, sat astride Tundra's back, her hands clasped around his neck. The little fox, who couldn't bear to miss out on any fun, was trying to take her seat behind Holly. This she hoped to accomplish by leaping wildly in the air at Tundra, who stepped neatly aside each time. Alexia couldn't understand why she was having no success, and Holly thought it was the funniest thing she had ever seen. But they did not astonish Nicholas. Tundra did. Here was Tundra, the majestic, the calm, the solemn Tundra, whom Nicholas had always declared should have been king in his stead, dancing across the floor with a baby on his back and a silly fox under his feet. To Nicholas's profound relief, he looked vastly amused. From that day on, Tundra divided his time between his old duties and his new. He was Nicholas's most trusted advisor, a conscientious voice of reason, and an astute and ready guardian. But he was Holly's companion, protector, and confidant, who watched over her with pride and tenderness. Sometimes Nicholas would come upon the two of them fast asleep, Holly's arm curled around her faithful friend, worn out from their day's play, and he would say to himself that it made perfect sense. Holly was the one person who could never remind the wolf of his lost Tara. Nicholas was grateful that his daughter had the loyalty and love of the being he most admired.